All right. So today we are talking about ecology. Okay, and this is just going to be a kind of a quick introduction into ecology. We'll look a little bit more into some things come Wednesday. But anyway, so ecology. Ecology is kind of my favorite part of um, biology. This is why I like to save it generally for the end. It's something fun to kind of end on, especially as spring's starting to roll around and we're kind of able to do some stuff outside. Granted, if I had known that we weren't going to have a quarter of in-person school, I probably would have done this a little bit earlier. But anyway, so ecology. What is ecology? So ecology is the study of organisms and their interactions with each other and their environment. Okay, so basically it's looking at how organisms of one species interact with each other, how organisms of different species interact with each other, and then how organisms interact with their surrounding environments. Okay, and essentially in our world, ecology is going to be looking at this thing called the biosphere. Okay, and so the biosphere is one of our four main spheres that we have. So you're going to have the geosphere, which is everything that involves, and now I can just type these out, but the biosphere is all living things comprised on planet Earth. Okay. Another thing we'll look at, the geosphere. Okay, this is all rocks and geologic activity, geologic activity on Earth. Okay, two more that we have is the hydrosphere. This is going to be all water and it's cycling on Earth. And then finally you have the atmosphere. Okay, and the atmosphere is all gas on planet Earth. Okay, and all four of those spheres combine to essentially become and create what is the Earth. Okay, what creates life. All right, so but the biosphere is all living things comprised on planet Earth and things that support life. Okay, so we have those things. When we're looking at the biosphere specifically, okay, so this is going to be going back to specifically biosphere. Okay, there are going to be a couple of different things. All right, ecologists study essentially these organisms in biosphere their adaptations and the factors in their environment. Okay, and these are pretty much split into two main factor groups. Okay, so the first factor group is going to be called biotic factors. Okay, so we have our biotic factors, and this is essentially just going to be things called, or our biotic factors are all living factors in an organism's environment. Okay, and so what we can kind of think about here is if, let's think about like for a fish, like a salmon, they're going to have the different biotic factors are going to be other fish. You're also going to have things like algae. Algae is a living organism. Frogs, microscopic organisms, bugs that are in that water, okay? All of these things are going to be part of their direct ecosystem. However, you also have to think about with salmon, when they're making their run up, there's a lot of things that prey on them. There are, birds of prey like hawks and eagles, osprey, all those sorts of things that will take them, bears, so on and so forth. All of these are parts of biotic factors, okay? And the interaction among these different organisms is basically necessary for the health of the ecosystem, okay? So the interactions of organisms in an ecosystem creates essentially, how do I want to put this? Creates a healthy environment as long as interactions are balanced. Okay, and so we have our biotic factors. All right, I'm going to go ahead and move this up a little bit. Okay, so you're going to have your biotic factors, and the other thing we have are abiotic factors. Okay, and as we've learned earlier in the year, the prefix A just means non, so these are non-biotic or non-living factors, okay? So these are all non-living factors in an organism's environment, okay? And there's a lot of different things that these can include, but these can include things like the geography of a region, and that's a pretty easy one to think about, but these can also include things like temperature, essentially the air currents, sunlight, types of soil, rainfall, and then things like available nutrients. Okay, all of these abiotic factors are essentially what are going to create these, or essentially dictate what organisms can live there, okay? So something that, a cactus does well in a desert because it doesn't need a whole lot of rainfall, okay? They can hold their water pretty well, all right? So organisms essentially adapt, or the best adapted organisms survive in ecosystems due to their ability to cope with abiotic factors. Okay? So when we're just looking at ecology in general, the different spheres, and then these two sets of factors, are there any questions as of right now about any of these things? I will take that as a no. Does anybody need the notes still? Again, I am recording this, so it'll be up on YouTube later today.
Yes.
You're taking notes, Max?
Yes.
All right, let me know when you're done with these, okay?
Okay.
Do you need to move the ecology back down, or do you have that?
I have that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Just let me know when you're done. But yeah, And so again, we'll know a little bit more after tomorrow. I'll know more by next or on Wednesday's meeting about exactly what the plan is. But I know tentatively we've got this class Wednesday and then the 2 classes next week. And then as long as you have a passing grade, you're done if you want to be. And if you want to improve your grade, you can keep working on things and turning things in. So,
Hey, Schultz,
hey,
is the grade for like after they've averaged all the quarters or just the fourth quarter grade?
that's a good question. I'll need to ask that for sure. The grade I would focus on if I were you the most would be your semester grade because that's the one that's the most important. Um, but I mean, essentially, so I mean, like dual, you have a passing grade for both the quarter and the semester. Like you're good. But if you wanted to get like say you were at an 87 and you wanted to get into that 90 range, those last 2 weeks would be a great couple of 2 weeks to work on doing something to improve your grade.
Okay.
Yeah. You good yet, Max? Or
I think I got it.
okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so let's go ahead and we'll clear this. Let's start talking about our next set of things, which is just going to be essentially the levels of organization of ecology. Okay, and there are going to be, oh, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 essentially 6 levels. You could again probably bump it to a 7th level. But the levels of ecology are this. So there is at the lowest level, you're going to have individual organisms. Okay, and these are living organisms that are part of a larger ecosystem. Okay, so you, me, all of us are individual organisms. We represent the individual organism at this first level of ecology. Again, you can probably go lower than this too and start looking at cellular stuff, but when you're looking at ecology, you're really just kind of focusing on organisms, individual organisms being at that lowest level, okay? And now cells and bacteria and single-celled things can be organisms. They are organisms, but organisms can also be things like you, me, a cow, a buffalo, elephant, all of those different things. The next level up is going to be populations, okay? And populations are essentially just a group of organisms of the same species that live in the same geographic location. Okay? And so, again, a group of, you can think of this kind of like white sulfur, right? This town, we've essentially just, it's full of people, okay? There's, I think, roughly 1,000 people in white sulfur. We are a population, okay? That's our population number is roughly 1,000. And those are organisms. There are humans, obviously there are other organisms in there, but when we're just looking at humans, these are the same species that have grouped together in the same geographic location, all right? And generally, these organisms are going to have to compete against each other, especially when you talk about other animals. That's why there's only a certain number of population that generally can live in one area. We'll talk a little bit more about the relationship between these organisms later on today. So after you get past populations, which is looking at a group of organisms of the same species living together, you have our third step, biological communities. Okay? And biological communities are essentially going to be a group of interacting populations that live in the same geographic location. So part of our biological community in White Sulphur Springs is obviously going to be people. There's quite a few deer in town, obviously. You can also look, again, not just at only animals, the different trees and grasses and plants that we have in this area. All of those things factor into our biological community. But again, when we're looking at biological communities, this is only looking at the living things within a geographic location. The next step after this, so instead of just looking at your biological communities, you're going to start getting into your ecosystems, okay? So an ecosystem is a biological community and all abiotic factors that affect that community. Okay, so again, if you were looking at White Sulphur as the biological community, we've established that there are people, there are deer, there are dogs, there are cows, there's all these different things, as well as the plants and tree, you know, all of this sorts of stuff. The bacteria that live here are part of it. When you start looking at the ecosystem, you have to look at how much rainfall do we get? What is the temperature like at different times of the year? All of those things are going to be the abiotic factors that go into determining what an ecosystem is and what an ecosystem can support. All right. Again, if you were going to stick an elephant in the middle of the little belts, probably wouldn't do super well, mainly due to the fact of how cold it gets and there's not all of the necessary supports it has. But elk are going to do just fine up there. All right. And that again is due to those abiotic factors. Those determine what can live there due to specific adaptations. All right. And then there are two left after this. So once you have your ecosystems, then you're going to move into the biome. Okay. And so a biome is a large group of ecosystems that share the same climate and have similar. Katie, can you mute yourself? Of communities. Okay. And so we're looking at, they have, these are a bunch of ecosystems that are grouped together in one area. And they have, again, that same climate. That climate's going to be the big thing that kind of determines where things can live. And a lot of the similar organisms live there. Okay. And so if you were going to look at like Africa, Africa has a lot of different ecosystems in it. But if you were going to look at specifically the savanna, that is a biome, okay? The large African savanna. Within that savanna, there are several different ecosystems that can differ just based on altitude or the geography of it might change how much rain one area of the savanna gets comparative to another. But the whole area combined is a biome. And around our United States, planet Earth, we have, I want to say, roughly 15 to 20 biomes, just kind of depending on who you're talking to. And these biomes do, while they aren't always the exact same, do pretty much consistently determine what kind of things can live there based on these abiotic factors, okay? And that has to do almost exclusively with climate. And then finally, once you have all of your different biomes, again, like I said, that roughly 15 to 20 different biomes that you have, you're going to have 6, the biosphere. Okay, and the biosphere is just all biomes and living things on planet Earth grouped together make the biosphere. Okay, and so this right here are these levels of organization within a community or within ecology, excuse me. And so there's a lot of people. Being an ecologist is a pretty specific thing. Usually when people are, obviously ecologists are looking mainly at ecosystems, but there are some people who are specifically just population ecologists, some that are community ecologists. Some people like to look at bigger and broader things and look at a whole biome. All of these different things are going to be within that greater umbrella of ecology. All right? Does anybody have any questions about this?
No.
Okay, and Max, are you taking notes still?
Not this time.
Okay, perfect, thank you. I will get going on the last set of stuff that we have, and these are all just the basic principles of ecology. Obviously, we'll go more in depth on this, but we have to look at kind of interactions of organisms, okay? And so, essentially, interactions of organisms. Organisms can have two types of interactions. They can have ecosystem. Interactions. Okay, and these are going to be things like essentially how organisms fit into their habitat. Okay, and habitat is going to be an area where an organism lives. Okay, very easily. And within that habitat, organisms generally have this thing called a niche, okay, or a niche. Some people prefer it one way or the other. And so essentially, your niche or niche within your habitat is going to be the role or position an organism has within that environment. Okay, and so these ecosystem interactions, your niche is going to be a huge thing that you play. Things like worms or fungus or bacteria, those are going to be decomposers. They have a huge niche where they are taking dead organisms and essentially putting that nutrients back into the soil where it's usable. Things like wolves are predators, and they're also a keystone species. They keep specific populations of organisms in check. We'll probably look at the interaction between the wolves in Yellowstone and the elk population and how that threw everything out of whack back in the 90s or the 1900s, and then when they were reintroduced in the 90s. But yeah, there's a whole big thing there that essentially these niches or niches and how organisms fit into that puzzle of their habitat into an ecosystem. That's how they interact within their ecosystem. But then we also have to look at these community interactions. Okay, and these are going to be how organisms interact with one another. Okay, and so within a community, you're going to have a whole bunch of different types of interactions, but we're going to look at it, and there are 5 main ones that we will look at. Okay, and the first one is going to be competition. Okay, so competition is basically where one or more organisms are competing for the same resources. Okay, now competition only happens when there is a limited supply of resources. If there's enough resources to go around, they will not compete against one another. They generally are pretty non-confrontational. But once it comes down to, this food or this water is going to be utilized by me or you, it's going to be whoever can outcompete gets the right to that resource. Okay. And kind of like when we were talking about with evolution, with natural selection, organisms that can outcompete do better and pass on their traits. Okay, so we have that. And competition can happen interspecies. So if you're looking at a deer population, a white-tailed deer will compete against other white-tailed deer, but then you can also look at intra-species. So they're going to be competing against mule deer, elk, all of those different organisms for specific resources. Okay. Once we get past competition, you can start looking at predation. All right. And predation is just going to be the act of one organism pursuing and consuming other organisms for food. Okay. So again, predation, I feel like that's one that you guys can you can understand that predators they need to get their food from other organisms. They're not autotrophs. They cannot make their own food. And so they need to eat other organisms. So that is the predation factor. And the last one we're going to look at are these things called symbiotic relationships. Okay, so symbiotic relationships are essentially just how two or more species live together. Okay, so two or more species living together. And there are going to be three types of symbiotic relationships that we're going to look at. One is mutualism. Okay, so with mutualism, this is essentially where two organisms live together and both organisms benefit. Okay, so you can think about if you've ever seen those birds that essentially sit on hippos and peck off all the bugs. That's a mutualistic thing. The birds are getting the meal, and the hippos are letting them be on there, but the hippos themselves are getting these bugs removed from them that they would have a hard time removing otherwise. And so the birds get a meal, and they get a pretty safe and easy meal because the bugs are living on the hippo. And then the hippo gets free bug removal service. It's a pretty easy one. Similar with, you'll see that a lot where birds and other organisms do pretty well with one another. But anyway, another type of relationship is going to be called commensalism. Okay, and this is going to be where one organism benefits and one organism gets a neutral. Gets neutral. I don't want to say benefits. What's a good way to put this? Gets neither positive or negative. Okay, and so things like this would be things like if you've seen like remora fish. Now, remora fish could be potentially mutualism. Those are the ones that follow sharks. But essentially, remora fish are just kind of following sharks, and when sharks make a kill or they start eating on stuff, remora fish eat the scraps. All right. There's some people that say that remora fish do get some benefits there, but again, for the most part, nothing too crazy in terms of anything there. But so commensalism is that one, and then the final one that we'll look at. So we've looked at where one organism gets a benefit. We've looked at where two organisms get a benefit. Now we're going to look at parasitism. Okay, and this is going to be where one organism benefits and one organism is negatively impacted. Okay, so any sort of parasite that you can think of is they are in there and they're harming the host in some form or fashion. Now, if you're a good parasite, if you're a smart parasite, you're not going to kill your host, okay? Because parasites need hosts to survive. However, some organisms do that, and they need to kill the host in order for their offspring to essentially be brought forward. And so it all just kind of depends on what you're looking at. But does anybody have any questions about any of these interactions of organisms?
So I've heard this like one like fungus that like attaches itself to like other bugs, and then like it controls their mind and then brings them to a high place, and then they just slowly die or something, and then the fungus like grows off those dead bodies. So that would be like an example of parasitism, or
Yes,
that word.
that would and that's if you type in like zombie ants, that's definitely something. I don't know the exact name of that, but I know it's pretty commonly referred to as like the zombie fungus, because especially when you're in a lot of like rainforest ecosystems, ants typically live pretty much exclusively on the rainforest floor. But yeah, occasionally you'll see these ants that are just cruising up a tree as high as they can go. And those are going to be things that have gotten that kind of zombie again. This parasite that is essentially invading and taking over and killing the ant from the inside, and then they kind of take over its body. So
that's not settling.
Any other questions? All right. Is anybody still taking notes on this portion?
No.
All right. I'm going to stop sharing that. Okay. Does anybody have any questions about